As a player, I'm probably most known for my aggression. I like to put my opponents on their back foot and make them respond to my actions as I cut my way through the enemy team. But what keeps me alive during many of my killing streaks is my understanding of the defensive mechanics in Chivalry 2. I'm Strider the Champ, and today's video is my ultimate guide on defensive technique. This guide is intended to help all levels of players, from beginners up to players with many hours on the battlefield. We'll cover topics such as ripostes, counters, counterfeiting, and movement-based defense. If you find this guide helpful, please subscribe. Now, before we start, there are two terms we need to be familiar with: initiative and gambling. When we talk about initiative, we're talking about your turn or right to attack. Think of Chivalry like a card game. Every player has a turn to cast their cards. Your attack is your card cast. However, unlike card games, the enemy does not have to respect your turn and can choose to attack anyway. This is called gambling. Gambling is generally frowned upon as a tactic used by poor and newer players. However, I don't love this term because it's so broadly applied. For instance, I've had people complain about me gambling when often they start their attack out of range, so knowing that they will miss, I ignore their initiative and attack with my longer weapon. It's not always gambling if you know you're gonna win. Now let's start our talk about defense with the easiest, most used, and worst form of defense: holding block. Holding block is brain dead, easy to do, and relatively effective at keeping you alive in team objective modes. The small amount of skill involved with holding to block is just keeping your weapon pointed at the enemy's blade. Successfully blocking an attack also grants you the initiative and allows you to perform a riposte. To perform a riposte, you simply attack immediately after a successful block. This attack will also grant you a very short active parry window, which will deflect incoming attacks while your riposte is being performed. All in all, blocking and riposting are pretty strong, along with being very simple to perform, which is why the majority of the player base only uses this form of defense. However, there are some serious drawbacks to using this method of defending yourself, and just like in boxing, covering up should be your last form of defense. The big issue with holding block is that it will rapidly drain your stamina. Add in performing other actions like feints, combinations, or dodges, and you will quickly find your character huffing and puffing before being disarmed. Not having stamina can be the difference between getting one kill and dying, or chaining together a 1v5. Now, I mentioned this stamina issue for a very specific reason as we go into our second topic: countering attacks. At its core, counters are very basic. To perform a counter, you simply recognize the attack your opponent is throwing, and while holding block, throw the same attack back at them. This is the only way to actively recover stamina in the game, and being able to counter attack the basic slash, stab, and overhead attacks regularly will make you better than the majority of the player base. This is something that is best learned through conscious focus and repetition. Go into games with the plan on countering as many attacks as possible, and while you might be less successful at first, in the long run you'll be a much improved player. And did I mention that countering also gives you a longer active parry window than a riposte, making it essential in 1vx situations. Now, I said at its core that countering is an easy concept, but in reality it can be much more difficult. Players will utilize various techniques such as drags and feints to bait out your counters. This is probably where the largest skill gap between players is, and if you can learn to regularly counter dragged or feinted attacks, you'll be one of the better players in your lobbies. I have some very basic advice to help you guys with countering both of these concepts. In general, you want to wait until the end of your enemy's attack to throw out your counter. Sometimes we recognize our enemy's attacks and jump the gun a bit by immediately countering. If our opponent feints into another strike or drags their attack, we are, as they like to say, screwed. Ideally, we like to wait for the end of their strike to counter. Better to miss a counter that winds up being a riposte than to give the enemy a free hit on a dragged heavy attack. Now, a bonus tip here for countering dragged attacks is that if you're like me and you're not a perfect player, you'll sometimes fall for your opponent's tricks or mistime your counters. If you throw out your counter too fast and you know the enemy's heavy or dragged attack will hit you, you can sometimes save the counter by using your footwork. Simply move your character directly at the attack, which will shorten the distance between the strikes, which gives you a chance of the counter still landing. Now, when we talk about countering feinted attacks, it's again about maintaining the discipline to hold your counter until the end, because if your opponent feints, you're screwed. Countering feinted attacks can be difficult as your mind has to register the first strike, then quickly register the second attack while reacting fast enough to still counter it. It can be pretty difficult. In public lobbies, you'll see very few players countering feinted attacks. Now again, if you're like me and not perfect, you will sometimes fall for a well-timed feinted attack, and Torn Banner has given you a get-out-of-jail-free card in the form of the defensive feint or counterfeit. Remember how on offense you can feint one attack into another? Well, on defense you can feint or change your defensive counter into a second counter. So for instance, if your opponent throws a slash into an overhead and you fall for it by throwing out a slash to counter their initial attack, you can recognize your mistake and feint that slash into an overhead to perform a counterfeit. This is a technique that's generally performed by more advanced players, as your mind needs to very quickly process that you screwed up, how you screwed up, and then how to make things right in very rapid succession. This is a technique that I would add to your skill set as a last resort, and here's why. You might ask, well, why don't you just counter-feint every attack? It seems like the best of both worlds, and I have that answer for you. Many better players will mix heavy attacks and drags into their feints. A counter-feint will throw out normal attacks. If your opponent mixes in a heavy, your counter-feint will not have the correct timing, and you will be hit. So it's better to maintain discipline and directly counter attacks when possible. Now our final topic is footwork and defensive movement. I feel like this is the hardest topic for me to talk about and show, but I'll do my best to get you started on making your opponents whiff their attacks with movement. Now most of the players I see in public lobbies will fight in one of two ways. They'll either stand still or they'll move directly back in a straight path. Now, the first method is just completely wrong, as players will try to move to your side, and the second way of moving backwards will generally end bad for a few reasons. Reason one, you move slower moving backwards than forward, so enemies will close the distance on you landing their shots no matter what, and players tend to manage distance poorly and fight face to face with their opponents, meaning that they will never get out of range of an opponent's counter or riposte by trying to outrun it backwards. However, let me give you an example of how you can utilize backwards footwork effectively. I've talked in previous videos about managing distance and trying to land with the tip of your weapon. If you're fighting a shorter weapon, you can make the read on this and attack them at max range. Even if they block, this is fine, as you're trying to bait out their counterattack. As you begin immediately moving back, you can recognize that they will miss. Let them miss, and then immediately move forward to punish them with a free hit. You can even add in a dodge back if you know it's going to be close. This is the concept I talked about in the beginning, gambling when you know you will win. Now, lateral movement is the hardest thing for me to teach, but super effective at keeping you alive. If you've ever played an FPS game and heard the term AD spam, where you just constantly wiggle in either direction, this can be applied to Chivalry. Moving side to side in an unpredictable pattern is a very effective tactic to make players miss overhead and stab attacks. And as your ability to read enemy attacks improves, you can recognize the direction attacks are heading and move in the opposite direction. Footwork is great for when you messed up a counter and you need to make the enemy miss, while better players can still sometimes drag their attack with you. In public lobbies, many times effective footwork can allow you to weave through enemies as they miss their attacks and team damage each other, allowing you to go on killing sprees. That brings us to the end of our ultimate defensive guide. Subscribe to the channel, follow on Twitch, champ out.